to the Brisbane Safety Differently Book Club. Sorry, Jessie, you're not getting the full treatment, but that's okay. This is the next best thing as far as you're concerned. But Jessie, I was just wondering if you could maybe just tell us a bit about yourself and your motivation for writing this amazing book.
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Jessie Singer. I'm a journalist and I'm the author of There Are No Accidents, The Deadly Rise of Injury and Disaster, Who Profits and Who Pays the Price, which was published by Simon & Schuster in 2022, and is now out in paperback. The book was inspired by a horrible thing. My best friend, who was killed by a drunk driver in 2006, he was riding his bike along the West Side Greenway, which is a protected bike path that runs along the west side of Manhattan. And he was killed by a driver who mistakenly turned and entered this path and drove downtown for more than a mile. And the man who killed him was drunk and speeding and went to prison. And for a long time, I wasn't going to write a book. It was just a horrible thing that happened to me. But I came to write this book and came to become deeply interested in safety after something that would happen 11 years later, which is that a different man rented a truck and he followed the exact same path as my best friend's killer, driving downtown on this separated bike path. Except this man didn't mistakenly turn onto the path. He turned onto it intentionally. And he killed 8 people and severely injured 11 in an act of vehicular terrorism. And I remember at the time being so shocked because it was the exact same thing if you looked at it one way, right? It was the same mechanism of injury, it was the same location, it was the same setup of the event. And the only thing that was different was the intention, but the 2 different events were treated really differently in the media, by the government. Eric's death was called an accident, and this other attack was called terrorism. And the city and state responded to it. They barricaded every single entrance to this bike path after the attack. And for me, it was this shocking realization that accidents don't matter, even though they're wholly preventable. Because what was done to, protect this path could have prevented Eric's death. And when I looked into it, I learned that other people had been killed before and after my best friend on this same path. The drivers all made mistakes. Some were drunk, some were distracted, some were lost. Different mistakes, but all of those mistakes were just chalked up to accidents. And so people kept dying in this place that was clearly full of safety holes because they were all considered accidents, which led me to start to look at accidental death in the US at large and all of the different things outside of traffic that we sweep under this rug of, sort of willful ignorance and apology for things that we could prevent and choose not to because it costs money or it forces us to think a little bit more about how our roads or our homes or our workplaces are structured. And after that, my background as a journalist, and I just became sort of obsessed. And the end result is this book.
Look, pretty powerful opening for me. You stated like really early in the book that it matters who tells the story of the accident. So the one who tells the story holds the power, and the power determines what story that we're going to hear. And it's usually the powerful ones are really the victim. Personally, when Steve and I talked about this section, we could relate it to like how even investigations are written. So can you explain to the community, explain a little bit about that? The one who tells the story holds the power.
Absolutely. I mean, my best friend's death actually gets exactly this, when I think it's important to note power can shift, right? Power can move. And so after my best friend was killed, he did not survive the crash, but the person driving the car did. And so that person told the story of my best friend's death to the police. That was the story of his death as it was recounted. And then the police investigated further and they told a different story of his death. And then the city officials who managed this unsafe bike path, they told a story too, because they had a little more power than the police, and they could say, oh, this was just an accident. There's nothing to be done here. And so in that way, the power over who told the story of Eric's death defined what would happen after it. I think you all in the safety community are in an especially interesting position because you are storytellers. I mean, your root cause analysis, your investigations are narratives of things going wrong. And the narrative you construct is ideally the thing that defines what happens next, right? But I also think that knowing how the safety community works, you're in a tricky position, right? Because you don't always get listened to, do you? You know, your power is limited within the organization you're working in, within that organization's bottom line, within how much the CEO actually cares, and a lot of other things. But still, you are telling that first story, and I think an important thing to talk about when you're telling that story is that what you're doing is you're trying to find cause. And I think a mistake we often make is we think cause is truth. But cause is not truth. Cause is an opinion about hindsight. You know, and hindsight, you know, what should have been done is rarely insight. It feels like insight, totally feels like insight, because you're looking at this thing that happened and you're like, here's what should have been done. I'm so smart. Everyone feels that, right? But when it comes down to it, there's not, I think our desire to find cause legitimizes hindsight in a way that doesn't necessarily get back to, and I'm going to keep saying this, what happens next. You know, we focus a lot on what happened first, who did what wrong, and not so much on what's going to happen next when a slightly different error occurs under the same conditions. But like, I think this is a tricky thing. Like I said, in the safety community, you know, you decide who's heard, you decide whose voices are going to rise up in an investigation. But this is maybe a challenge, but you also decide who you're beholden to. So, you know, you might be getting paid by someone who would prefer a behavioral solution to an incident than a systemic one. And you might find cause accordingly because you want to keep your job. And that is often a tricky line to walk, because you're going to find cause based on what you have the power to change. And often you only have the power to change the rules or the, you know, the procedures or how people are told what to do. Which is to say, with full solidarity, the safety community is constantly in a tricky position of knowing how things go wrong and being beholden to the way the system works.
Brilliant, Jessie. That was absolutely brilliant. That's exactly how people feel. Just when you were talking about there, we do have the power to share the story, but we're also mindful that our organisations will say, "Hey, you know, that's expensive" or whatever. And just following up on that though as well, Jessie, you know, it's like it's so easy for us to blame, you know, they could have, would have, should have. You talked about hindsight there, you know, our vision's always 20/20 in hindsight, right? But what do you think it is? It's like it just makes people compelled to find blame in others. What's your thinking?
I mean, I think these are really basic and even very well documented, like, psychological concepts that we all fall victim to well outside of safety, you know? I mean, like, the fundamental attribution error is like the most basic construct of our brains. We're doing it constantly. We're doing it like on social media. We're doing it in the grocery store. And so of course we're going to do it when, you know, two big things rise up, when there's cognitive dissonance, you know, when there is fear for our safety and a desire to resolve it. And I think resolving cognitive dissonance and also resolving the urge to be protected are so base. They're so deep in us. And so when we find someone to blame, what we are doing at the very core is saying, it couldn't happen to me. Because when you found someone to blame, you found a way to separate yourself from this. So even if you're an outside observer, you want to know you can't drop that thing on your toe. And so if you look at the person who dropped that heavy thing on their toe and you say, well, they should have done this differently, what you're really saying is, here's how I would do it differently. And this is an evolutionary function. If you noticed that your neighbor was killed by a tiger while hunting in tall grass, then you were less likely to get killed by a tiger while hunting in tall grass. And we just don't live in that world anymore. We're not hunting tigers. We're not faced with dangers in the raw natural world. In fact, we live in a world of overlapping safety systems. But I think that evolutionary function, that self-protective function of saying like, oh, I wouldn't do it like that, remains deeply embedded and protects us. It feels comforting to find what someone else did wrong. It makes us feel like we're safe. And the problem is, of course, that means that all the holes in those overlapping safety systems that do exist don't get corrected because we're constantly focused on who did what wrong.
Look, you're spot on, and that probably leads us into, accidents usually have this presumption that they're caused by someone doing something wrong, someone wasn't paying attention, caused by an accident-prone person even, or people making bad decisions, and all we get judgmental and we think people did things the wrong way. Instead, in your book, you explored that idea that accidents actually occur, or often occur, within environments that are actually inherently dangerous or poorly designed. Can you talk us through like some of your findings with this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting. This was something I believed, and then I watched the data back it up again and again and again. But maybe it's easier to start with an analogy. You can slip and fall anywhere. You can trip anywhere. But on a wet floor, you're going to fall harder and faster, and you're going to be less able to stop yourself. You're going to be more likely to fall. The error can happen anywhere. Under dangerous conditions, the error is more likely, less likely to be stoppable, and more likely to cause harm. And so what we see is that essentially design, environment begets behavior. Systems beget behavior. And you can see this in, I'd ask you to throw scenarios at me, but you can see this in almost any environment, because the truth is that not that certain environments are dangerous, but that all environments are dangerous, that we are at risk. But for example, we talk about something like traffic crashes, and we're like, oh, some people are just bad drivers. But if we look at road design, then we see if lanes are wider and straight, drivers drive faster. If lanes are narrow and curved, drivers drive slower. Nations that design their roads narrower and curvier have fewer traffic crashes. There are better drivers in Norway than in the US. No, they design their roads differently. They design their systems differently. And so you see that across the board, that within a location where you control the environment with the purpose of reducing harm. And reducing harm is almost always about physics. It's almost always about controlling dangerous energy, whether that dangerous energy is too much of a drug, or the speed of a road, or the amount of air that is passing through a building should it catch fire. The same thing applies, that controlling that energy controls the harm, and then nothing else really matters. Mistakes don't matter.
Yeah. Jessie, Josh just touched on the accident-prone worker, and you've written about that too. And do you know what? And do you know what? This was debunked and just before the World War, or during the World War, I think it was in the 40s. But people still talk about the accident-prone worker. So I was just like, how could we as safety professionals, Jessie, sort of start to really open up that conversation and say, hey, this is, that was debunked years ago. How can we start having those conversations about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because it's like, it actually was never even bunked. Like, all of the research that originally established the idea of the accident-prone worker is all false. And that an interesting thing is, when the idea was being really popularized in the US, all these there was the rise of industrial psychology as a field, and there were all these industrial psychologists brought on by factories to try and prove which workers were accident prone and create a definitive test for the accident prone worker. And we're talking about countless hours, hundreds of studies. No one has ever proven accident proneness. Just total bunk. But we just talked a bit earlier about why it persists, because we wanted to. We want to find someone to blame, right? We want to find a way to keep ourselves safe. And so something I like to get at is, I ask people, is it working? That's my challenge. You've spent X amount of dollars and X amount of hours on mindfulness programs and new rule books and those signs. Is it working? You know, has your rate of incidents declined? Because the answer is always no. And then you can come to them and say, cool, well, why don't we try something else? Because that's not working. Why don't we try slowing down the assembly line? Why don't we try, you know, reducing the amount of hours in a working day? Why don't we try changing the system? Because changing the worker, it hasn't worked. You tried. Look at how much. Add it all up. Show them the books. Like, look at how much you spent trying to change the worker. Cool. What if we try, you know, let's just spend a week trying to change the work and see what happens. I was talking to, I go around the country and I give talks to, you know, about safety. And I was speaking to a consortium of hospitals. And, you know, when I talk about safety, I insist on talking about it with the broadest possible lens. I say, you know, hospital safety is the same as road safety, is the same as drug use safety. You know, these are all connected. You know, the science is all the same. The lines are all the same. And this was a group of hospital CEOs, and I'd really pissed one of them off by saying this. He gets up and, you know, gives a whole lot, you know, more of a comment than a question. He talks for a long time about how I'm so wrong, you know, and that his industry is nothing like other industries, and medicine is incredibly unique. And he says, you know, we've been working on human error for 20 years and we haven't solved it. And I'm just, and I, you know, I just pause and I say, yes, exactly. Why don't we try something else? But, you know, this was a hospital CEO, and I said, you know, it's going to start with you spending money, because fixing the worker, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Jessie. And it's funny that everybody says their industry's different, don't they? Like in Australia, we're like, oh, mining's different, oil and gas different, oh, we're different from other industries, but we're not really, right? You know, it's like we still have all those people. Mate, I was going to. Yeah, that's it. You know, like, how do we, and that's what we keep talking about all the time, isn't it, Josh? Like, how do we fix the work? You know, how do we look at improving the work? What happens next? But yeah, it is a massive challenge. And I tell you what, Jessie, that little clip that you've just went on there, that's the thing that we'll have to show people and say, this is, like, we just can't stop. I still can't believe I hear people talking about this. There's another thing I also can't help believe that people keep talking about as well. And this is really relevant to me because the conversation has again just come up recently about accountability and forward-looking accountability. Now, in the book you talk about, there was someone, Marianne McCabe, I think, is it? You can't have safety without strong empathetic relationship with others, and it totally is the foundation of safety, in my opinion. But do you kind of feel when we talk about accountability, are organisations going on that journey, or is it the forward-looking accountability? I mean, do you kind of feel like organisations are going on this journey, or is it just the same old with them, trying to fix 100 years of safety?
I mean, it's such a tricky question, especially like in different places. You know what I mean? Like speaking for, you know, the U.S. Versus where you are versus other countries. I mean, I think that people know when organizations have their interests at heart. I do think that becomes clear on a personal level. But, you know, and priorities are what makes that evident. You know, like, I think often we talk about safety as a priority without talking about the bottom line. And those things, then it's not a priority, right? Because if you followed up, you'd be like, well, where does the bottom line fit into the priority list? They'd say, oh, the bottom line, and then safety after that. And which is fine. That's great. If they're being honest about it, that's great. But then safety is always going to not actually be the priority. And so there are so many ways to play lip service to safety. And like corporations have been, you know, honing this vocabulary for 150 years now, you know, since the Industrial Revolution. Like, we have just been like churning out different, you know, spit shines on safety first. And, you know, I think when it comes down to it, like, the one thing that matters is true priorities. And that's something I bring up. You know, I like to say that there are good examples. And so something you see in like in the drug use community and the drug safety community is harm reduction. And when we talk about harm reduction, you know, for people who use drugs, we talk about that keeping people alive is the only thing that matters. We don't care if they do drugs, don't do drugs, stop, or in treatment or not, keeping them alive. And so if that's your one priority, then you give everyone who uses opioids naloxone, you have safe injection centers, and you keep people alive. But if your priority is reducing drug use and drug safety, then people die. Vision Zero programs, where they're good. The ones in the US are terrible, but in like in you know what happened
in Australia as well.
Yeah, worldwide, I think.
But if you look at Sweden, what Sweden did was said safety will be the priority above all else. Above all else. If you get to work, if it takes too long to get to work, that's okay because safety. If there's traffic, that's okay because safety. So I think, sure, there's just so much ways to play lip service, but true prioritization is kind of like the one test, I think, of where things are truthfully accountable. And I think when you see that, also the numbers go down. Like it works, you know, we know it works. So if it's not working, it's probably not true safety.
Like that.
Yeah, good on you, mate. Yeah, that's a beautiful explanation.
Yeah, Jessie, in the book, it's a bit of a pivot too, but like chapter 3 is about scale, and you highlight some significant disasters that that seem to be expanding over time. That we've been talking in the safety community about, like increased complexity, and therefore we're not only having more accidents, but we're having more accidental disasters. What did you mean by this in the chapter, like scale? And is there anything that we can do to create awareness of this, of this, you know, complexity, and the idea that, you know, we're not only going to have more accidents, but there's actually going to be more accidental disasters?
Yeah, I mean, I think two good ways to look at scale and complexity. I don't know if you've gotten to your Charles Perrow in your book club yet, but you know, tightly coupled systems and loosely coupled systems, and like how likely you're going to be able to arrest the disaster, how likely the disaster is going to be, you know, consequential and monumental, versus not. You know, a door blowing off a Boeing plane is a good example, versus a nuclear meltdown, in terms of how the scale of harm might grow exponentially. But something I like to talk about with this, because I feel like so much of safety science in the disaster world is like contained within the four walls of a factory or a nuclear power plant, in a way that, to me, is extremely focused on very rare things and ignoring that which kills most of us on a daily basis. But I think what's interesting about that is thinking about climate change. So one of the things we're seeing with climate change is an increase in very surprising accidental deaths. So in Texas, all of a sudden, which is a very hot state in the US, southern United States, there's blizzards, and hundreds of people die of hypothermia because none of the houses are built to stand a blizzard. Something we're seeing is horrible, massive traffic accidents at the US border because there's a migration crisis, and people are filling vehicles with 20, 30 people in an SUV and sprinting them across the border, which is a byproduct of a climate change driven migration crisis. In New York City recently, we've had hurricanes that start all the way in Louisiana, coming halfway across the country and hitting where I live, New York City, so hard that basement apartments flood. And so people are accidentally drowning in basement apartments. So what we're talking about are failures of our built environment, of our infrastructure system, you know, our roads, our homes, coming into conflict with a tightly coupled weather system that we can't control. And that's kind of what it gets back to. It's what can we control? And the thing we can do is build our environments, right? We can future-proof our environments for an increase in these small accidental harms that are only going to build in scale as storms grow and as weather gets weirder. It's not a pretty future, but it is something that there are parts of it that are in our control.
Yeah, it's funny that, and what you're just talking about there, the houses, like in Queensland where we are, Jessie, see that we get these wild weather extremes, And flooding has just become the norm now. And this, I mean, the temperature this summer, honestly, I've never experienced anything like it. And since I've been in Australia, I've been down here 20 years, and it's just unbelievable. But I've noticed the insurance companies now are starting to take a vested interest in designing homes that are sort of like weatherproof and that they can just be put back up again. It's something it's really, really interesting.
Yeah.
So maybe well, it's obviously costing the insurance company money, right? So that's why they're taking this big interest. But I mean, we're just chatting about the Brisbane Safety Differently book club. Is we meet in a bar, and one of the things that you wrote in your book, and I really love this concept, and I actually used it in a meeting once, and they must have thought I was mad, because you talked about like making the world safe for drunks, and when you think about that on a deeper level, that's how many terrible things have happened to people because of alcohol. And if we're really serious about preventing all this stuff, maybe they should be looking at alcohol, but we know they never will. But again, how can we sort of support safety teams and people, Jessie, you sort of have that mindset about making the world safe for drunks?
This is a quote from Dr. Susan P. Baker, who's an epidemiologist here in the States, long retired, but who was a massively important safety expert. She helped popularize the child car seat and created injury severity scores that we use for hospital triage. And she said to me, the trick to it all is making the world safe for drunks. Because if you make it safe for drunks, you make it safe for people who are tired and people who are worried about this thing that's going on at home, and for the mom who's got a crying kid in the back seat. If you make it safe for them, you make it safe for everyone. Now, there's an obvious unspoken inverse of that, right? If you don't make the world safe for drunks, then it's only safe for perfect people. And that's what we do now. We design every system for perfect people. And that's why in the workplaces that you all operate in, there are so many rules. What those rules are how to be perfect, how to operate through the narrow path of this dangerous system that we've allowed for you. We have maximized the system to such a degree that it is so dangerous that there's only one narrow path through it, and it is the path that follows all of these rules perfectly. And what results from that is people get hurt because no one is perfect. And no one is perfect every day, and no one is always on, and no one always follows the rules. And so I like the idea of making the world safe for drunks because it upsets people. And it makes them think, oh, wait, we should make the world safe for drunks. People shouldn't be drunk. And it's like, oh, okay, so should they die? Like, let's follow it out. Is that what you're saying? And to be frank, I don't know about Australia, but in the US, definitely there are some people who think they should die. But fuck those people. Everyone else, by questioning, shouldn't we make the world safe for drunks? What we're saying is, aren't you drunk sometimes? Aren't we all sometimes drunk, even not alcohol drunk, just, stumbling and confused and sleepy and not paying attention and thinking about something else? Because we are. And we all want imperfect people to be safe too. And I think what helps about that is it really calls out why we build the world for perfect people, which is that we have other priorities, that we're maximizing something else, usually profit, and then requiring everyone to be perfect to stay safe.
Mic drop. Thanks, Jessie. Yeah. that's so powerful. I'm just personal reflection. Just had some pretty tough events happen at work, and it is exactly that. It's that demanding perfection, and mate, but it's just a succinct way of saying that, like, make the world safe for drunks, and that it's a real challenge. Look, in the book, you and no business is immune to this, right? And we've had other guests on before, gentlemen by the name of Rob Fisher, Gareth Locke, Clive Lloyd. All of them challenge rules at work. So in your book, you use an example with Georgina Pacific Paper Mills?
Georgia Pacific.
Yeah, Georgia Pacific, sorry. And they implemented a heap of safety policies, and they're trying to make workers adhere to those rules. But sometimes it's actually the culture of that place and the environment might not actually support, like, people following those rules, or simply having those rules in place might not actually be enough. Can you just discuss that with us? Why can't people just follow these rules at work?
I mean, I think there are a lot of reasons. I think one thing to understand is that the rules are almost never written by the people doing the work, which is like someone who doesn't know how to roller skate writing out how to roller skate, instructions on how to roller skate. That it's probably not going to help you roller skate. Another thing is that work changes all the time. Workplaces are dynamic, right? The weather changes work. The number of people who came to work that day changes the work. The specific job obviously changes the work, but the rules don't change. So the work changes all the time, but the rules don't change, which means often the rules don't make any sense for the work. The rules presume you're a machine, and not a human who's sleepy, having trouble at home, had 2 beers the night before, doesn't feel great. And those are all the best case scenarios of why people don't follow the rules. But at the core, and I think this was true, you were talking about a Georgia Pacific paper mill that was taken over by the Koch brothers, rather evil pair of financiers here in the US. But there was a similar story from a meat packing plant, and the meat packing plant, the man who ran the floor in the meat packing plant was talking about how things needed to be as safe as possible. People needed to follow the rules. He was this 50-page rule book. They worked so hard on it. People just wouldn't follow the rules. And in the background, he had a screensaver going, one of those words that bounces around the screen. And it said, run debone full speed. And the debone, that would be the debone line, where meatpacking workers were taking bones with very sharp knives and cold hands out of chickens, I think. And that's exactly it. These are all the rules. We're going to run the sharp, cold, wet, fast machine as fast as it goes. Which is to say, rules are a set of goals for safety based on the priority of making money.
Yeah.
As long as making money is the priority, then rules are just this really narrow path that you can walk through to survive your job.
Wow.
And
I love that. Yeah, that's amazing.
I mean, it's almost like the more rules a workplace has, the more dangerous it might be.
Yeah. Great point. Look.
Yeah, I know. Totally. Yeah, totally. I concur. I'm the same. I'm always challenging these things down here. I kind of feel that they're just targeted at people. They're not helping us be successful.
Yeah, I mean, I think that gets at a lot of it, is helping people be successful. Is that the goal of the rules? And I think it often isn't. And if it was, the workplace would be designed towards their success, and you would need less rules. You would control the environment in such ways that made that obvious. Here, and I do like to go back to traffic a lot, because everyone drives. And I think it's probably helpful for you all too, but go back to those road widths. If one thing we have in the US, I don't know if you have them there, automated speed safety cameras. They catch you speeding. Mm-hmm. Take a picture of your license plate. So if you're on a wide road with wide lanes, you're going to drive faster no matter what. That tells your brain to go faster. You're more likely to get a speeding ticket. And it's is it your fault? I don't know. Because that lane is really wide. And if they really wanted you to slow down, they could just narrow the lane width. But they don't. They want to move as much traffic through as possible. It's the same, as the factory output. So they keep the road widths wide, and, maybe you get punished, you get a ticket for not following the rules, but the road isn't designed to encourage you to follow the rules. There's no way in which that environment is actually targeted towards you being compliant, succeeding.
Yeah, awesome. Look, I'm going to ask another question, because I think it was chapter 8 is called Blame. And it's my favorite. It's actually my favorite chapter. I've listened to the audio book on it a couple of times, and I always go back to that one. But there's a quote in there. Blame is a food chain. Always look to the top. And you know how we draw attention away, we can and get distracted. We get away from those real root causes. And I really like how you've said, like, find the nuance in every accident, like demand a more detailed story. Can you help us as safety practitioners? Like, how do we fight in the corner who find themselves on the end of judgment from others?
Oh, I mean,
fix it, Jessie.
I mean, like, I think it's tricky because, you know, what you need is solidarity, right? Because someone who's in that corner, right? The people putting in that corner are who really needs to be challenged. And that often involves challenging the system, right? Like when we talk about blame being a food chain, what we're talking about is, you know, we want to blame the one worker who made a mistake, but the problem is the decisions that the CEO made about how to run the company. Your boss. Yeah. Everyone's boss. And so it's a really hard table to turn. And I think the key of it is helping management see how systems are unsafe before anyone has been hurt, before there's someone to blame, before the incident, so that they're connecting the dots and you're documenting it. And you've got on paper where things could go wrong, so that when they do, you've already written out the explanation. You don't need to investigate, right? You don't need to investigate, who, did what wrong first, because you've already laid out how the thing that's wrong is built into the structure of work.
Yeah. Jessie, where have you seen that done well? Like, where have you seen, like, okay, so if you talk about blame as a food chain, and it's almost like going through and looking at where the system is deficient, where have you seen people, like, or a business do that really well? Or have you, if you don't have an example, that's fine, but it's just more what we're trying to move as a community is that it is having those discussions with our workers and finding those weak signals and where they have to make do and where they have to adapt, and they're more likely where an event could happen. So just if you've got any examples of where you've seen it done well.
I mean, I think, I don't have a lot.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah,
but I think nursing, I see a lot of, where near misses become part of the public discourse within the system. Like real near miss conversations happening in the medical field, where I think there's a lot of, they have a lot of reason in the medical field, to fix things a lot sooner.
Yeah.
So, like you see that happening. But there aren't a lot of examples. I mean, and I think I would wonder, if in less like capital driven societies, there are better ones. I do talk about like transportation ones a lot. We talked a little bit about like changes that happened in Sweden, where they actually, they stopped prioritizing people getting to work on time over safety. They stopped prioritizing congestion over safety. And so I wonder if, and this is where it gets tricky in the business world, right? Because like, who's going to prioritize safety over their bottom line? So I think like in those scenarios, the ethical and moral thing to do is to let the people at the top of the food chain know what is going to happen.
Yep.
Yeah, totally. That's beautifully told, that story there. That was amazing. Jessie, we've talked about traffic and vehicles a wee bit in this, and I sort of dropped you a note about it, but we're starting to see the rise in popularity of these big, massive pickup trucks, the utes, right? They're really like I was actually beside one the other day and it spooked me a little bit. That's why I said to Josh, I'd really love to talk to Jessie about this. But yeah, like they're about 5 times the price of what they are in America. They're obviously higher end vehicles here, and people really are loving them. But I was just wondering if you could sort of maybe share, what are we going to see? What are going to be some of the unintended consequences of people owning these massive pickup trucks?
Oh, I'm so sorry. It's so bad. It's all our fault. And they won't do anything. You know, we have a regulatory system that's supposed to, you know, create safety structures around our vehicles, and they won't do anything about this because we can talk about why another time. Yeah, people are going to die. I mean, we have a trackable, definitive pedestrian and cyclist safety crisis in the US. The numbers are rising. It's directly attributable to vehicle size and a handful of other factors. Something we're also seeing, which is scary, is that people in smaller cars are more at risk from these mega vehicles because they're so large and they're so powerful to move their size. And as you can expect, I mean, that is directly a, you know, class and race-based slaughter. People in the US who are more likely to walk, to bike, and to drive smaller cars are more likely to be low income, people of color, and that's who gets killed in these crashes. And we pay more for these mega vehicles too. That's why the automakers sell them. They can sell them for more than they can for a sedan or a small car. And what we're seeing now, and you know, what results is that people walking and biking, and also people who can only afford like a Kia, are much more likely to be killed in these crashes. And what we're also seeing, and this is like the hardest to predict consequence, one that surprised me, but we're seeing a vehicular arms race because people want to protect their families. Mm-hmm. So people who have no interest in a Ford F-150 are buying a Ford F-150 because they don't want to put their family next to that giant vehicle and risk, you know, not protecting their people because that's the other vehicle on the road. The consequences will be disastrous. And the one thing I can offer you is that at least in the UK, they thought about passing laws to restrict their import, vehicles over a certain size and fuel economy. If you know local advocates in the transportation world, I would urge it before the problem gets worse, because it's self-perpetuating. You know, someone's more likely to get a big car if the big car is next to them, scaring them on the highway.
Yeah, actually, Jessie, that's exactly how I felt. So my wife's got one of these little Suzuki Swifts, just a tiny thing, and I was driving it, and it appeared, and I was like, oh, wow, this is massive. But yeah, I was just wondering, like, because they're so massive, it's just like they're going to have to change the way that we park, and so we've got other stuff to look forward to, have we?
Great.
Yeah,
it's gotten really bad here.
Yeah, and it's well, like I said, they're so expensive. They're really massive. You get a very nice European car for the same price you pay for these really massive trucks. But Jessie, we're going to finish off as we always do with my favourite part, because I'm such a big music buff. But New York City is uberly famous for all these amazing bands, right? And Josh loves the jukebox. So if Josh is going to be smashing out Blondie, the Beastie Boys, and a bit of Simon Garfunkel, what music are you going to take over and get everybody up on the dance floor?
Oh, you know, I live in Brooklyn, but I'm from Jersey. So Springsteen holds a place in my heart. Though I appreciate the Simon and Garfunkel because I've been singing, I have a little baby at home, and the 59th Street Bridge song, Feeling Groovy, is just like the perfect singing a baby to bed song. So I appreciate that in there. You know, I know you said New York City, but I do love the country music. And so one recommendation for all your folks out there, Steve Earle.
Yep.
Is a very, very good country musician who is always singing on the edge of safety because he sings about, you know, trucking, and, you know, just, you know, things in that edge. But he wrote an album called The Ghosts of West Virginia, which was made into a play called Coal Country, and it's about a mining disaster, a so-called mining accident at like a known unsafe mine. It's an album about what happens when safety goes wrong at its heart. It's a beautiful album.
Definitely. I would definitely check that out. Jessie, this has been, I knew it would be amazing. That you've surpassed it with its amazingness. So thank you so much for really joining us and doing your stuff with us. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you. The book's called There Are No Accidents. Jessie, we can find you in all the socials, can't we?
Yes, please.
And what I'm going to do now, if you don't mind.
Thanks for being so generous, Jessie. We all appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a real pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.